Most people read the same early Christian letters 100 times and never notice what's missing. It's not what Paul says about women, it's what the letters assume about them. And once you see it, the entire history of the church starts to look different. I'm going to show you how the first Christian communities actually worked, but more importantly, I'll show you why the records changed. Think about what the original texts reveal versus what we inherited. So if you've ever wondered why church leadership looks the way it does today, watch through to the end. Here's the real tension. Early Christian women held real power, documented power in homes and congregations. But almost every translation, every commentary, every sermon you heard filtered that out. The evidence is still there. You just have to know where to look. Let me start with a simple observation about ancient document writing. Letters survive because someone thought they mattered enough to preserve. Paul's letters to various churches weren't meant to be scripture at first. They were just mail. But in a minute, he'll show you the one detail that proves women were running entire congregations before those letters even arrived. First, let's talk about what a house church actually was. It wasn't a small gathering in a living room like we imagine today. A house church in the first century was a functional family business. Literally, the owner of the house held authority over who met, when, how often, and what happened there. That owner was called a deacon, elder, or sometimes a patron. And here's where it gets interesting. When Paul writes to church communities, he addresses people by their household status. He mentions specific names, and the names he emphasizes are women. Priscilla, with her husband Aquila, ran a church at their home in Ephesus. Phoebe was a deacon at Cenchreae. Lydia, a merchant who sold purple cloth, opened her household for believers in Philippi. So if you've ever wondered why church leadership looks the way it does today, watch through to the end. This is where most people stop noticing because they assume the text just naturally reflects reality. It doesn't. Ancient authors made choices about who to mention and who to ignore. The fact that Paul keeps naming women leaders means something. It meant they couldn't be ignored. Let me start with a simple observation about ancient document writing. Letters survive because someone thought they mattered enough to preserve. Paul's letters to various churches weren't meant to be scripture at first. They were just mail. But in a minute, he'll show you the one detail that proves women were running entire congregations before those letters even arrived. Here's what the system reveals about documentation. When you're writing a letter to a congregation you founded, you mention the people who matter operationally. You name the person who owns the house. You name whoever's handling money. You name whoever's teaching doctrine or handling disputes. Those 5 names in a 3-chapter letter tell you exactly who was making decisions. Paul's letters are stuffed with women's names because they ran things. That's the quiet evidence. Now here's where the history shifts dramatically. 1 generation later, those letters get copied, recopied, and reinterpreted. Timothy and Titus emerge as texts likely written after Paul's death that directly reverse what Paul's actual letters say. 1 Timothy tells women to remain silent in churches and not teach or have authority. But Paul's signature letters assume women are teaching and do have authority. The contradiction isn't subtle once you see it. This is the part nobody talks about. The early church had a crisis of documentation. As churches grew beyond individual homes into larger networks, the informal patronage system broke down. You can scale a system based on who owns which house. So the church needed structure, hierarchy, order, control. And the easiest way to create that structure was to restrict who could hold formal positions. Women were already leading in homes, but homes were decentralized and hard to manage. Formalized authority would be centralized and think about it practically. If women had no authority in early churches, why would Paul need to greet them by name? Why call them deacons? Why argue with Euodia and Syntyche, both women, about their disagreement, treating them as equals in conflict? You don't debate theological rivals you consider unimportant. Reset here. This is where it gets real. The letters are a time capsule. Paul's words freeze a moment when women and men were leading together, formally, publicly, by name. But within 40 years, those same letters are being reinterpreted through a completely different lens. institutional expansion instead of household function. Let me show you how this worked in different early Christian settings. In Corinth, Paul addresses his letter to the Church of God but quickly pivots to specific women and men managing disputes. Women were prophesying, speaking directly from God, and Paul's concern isn't that they're speaking, it's that their hair coverings are wrong. He accepts women prophets. He just wants them to follow social convention while doing it. That's pragmatism, not prohibition. Results vary by community, but the pattern holds. Paul assumed women prophets existed and needed etiquette coaching, not silencing. In Philippians, Paul settles a conflict between two women, Euodia and Syntyche, both described as his co-workers. The Greek word there is synergos, literally someone working alongside you in the mission. Paul calls on a male co-worker to help mediate, but he's asking a man to help resolve a dispute between two women who hold equal standing. He's not demoting them, he's managing a personnel conflict. Results vary, but this reveals the actual operational structure. In Priscilla's case, the historical record shows her teaching Apollos theology and doctrine, the highest intellectual work in early Christian communities. She's not singing hymns or organizing meals. She's doing theological education, and her husband Aquila isn't described as her supervisor. They're listed as a team. Results vary in how different communities applied this model, but the evidence is consistent about her role. Here's a concrete detail. Property ownership in the ancient world was expensive, rare, and male-coded. But the early church kept naming women who owned property and hosted churches. That's not coincidence. The church followed the patronage patterns of the broader culture. Whoever funded the space had authority over it. Women with money became church leaders because leadership followed property rights. It's that simple. The institutional church later solved this problem by formalizing leadership structures and, crucially, removing the property ownership requirement. If you're appointed by the bishop instead of elected by your household standing, your gender doesn't determine your power anymore. But neither does your economic independence. You now serve the institution, not your household. The shift looks like a modernization. It's actually a power consolidation. Let me trace what happened to the evidence itself. Original Paul's letters. Women everywhere in leadership positions, named, active. Second-generation texts, Timothy, Titus. Women silenced, restricted to specific domestic roles. Third-century church fathers, writing theological justifications for why Paul really meant women shouldn't teach, reinterpreting his letters to fit the institutional model they'd already built. Fourth-century codes, formalized restrictions written into church law. Medieval period onward, women's leadership roles completely disappeared from the narrative, not because evidence was destroyed, but because no one was looking for it. The documentation wasn't hidden, it was ignored, and there's a crucial difference. Hidden things get rediscovered. Ignored things vanish because they're never sought. Reset sentence. This is where it changes everything. The early church didn't start with institutional restrictions on women. It inherited them later. The original model was household-based, patronage-driven, and functionally gender-diverse in leadership. As churches became institutions, they became male, hierarchical. Not because Paul wanted that, not because Scripture demanded it, but because institutions scaled differently than household. Here is a concrete detail. Property ownership in the ancient world was expensive, rare, and male-coded. But the early church kept naming women who owned property and hosted churches. That's not coincidence. The church followed the patronage patterns of the broader culture. Whoever funded the space had authority over it. Women with money became church leaders because leadership followed property rights. It's that simple. That's not accidental. That's institutional memory. Here's a practical example. A modern church plant starts as a house church. The founder is a woman with a home, financial resources, and theological training. She teaches, leads, decides doctrine. That's structurally identical to Priscilla's situation. But as the church grows to 30 people, then 60, then 200, they need bylaws, board positions, organizational hierarchy. Suddenly, the woman founder isn't just the natural leader. She's a theological innovation that needs justification. The institution requires male leadership, not because of theology, but because institutions have default male patterns. Results vary, but this pattern repeats across denomination. The documentation wasn't hidden, it was ignored. And there's a crucial difference. Hidden things get rediscovered. Ignored things vanish because they're never sought. One more. A Bible study group discovers the evidence about women leaders in early churches. Half the group wants to reinterpret their church's restrictions. Half thinks the early church was wrong, and modern restrictions are correct. Both sides are using the same texts, but reading them through different institutional assumptions. Nobody's lying. Everyone's reading the evidence through the lens of their current system. Results vary, depending on which interpretation the institution will tolerate. Here's the mathematical reality. Women deacons named in Paul's letters. Minimum 8 to 10 documented churches mentioned across his correspondence, roughly 12 to 15 cities. This equals an estimated 40 to 60% of churches with identified female leadership. That's a conservative estimate of the documented infrastructure. Add in the unnamed women, and you're probably looking at institutional parity, not exception. Results vary by scholar, but the numbers suggest systematic female leadership, not occasional tolerance. Another calculation. Number of verses commanding women's silence in Timothy Titus 3 to 4 verses. Number of verses with women prophesying, leading, teaching in Paul's letters 15 plus references. This ratio suggests the restriction is the anomaly, not the norm. Results vary by how you count, but the proportions tell a story. Reset. And here's the part that actually matters. This isn't about modern politics or contemporary feminism. This is about how institutions reshape evidence to fit their own logic. The early church wasn't matriarchal. It was household-based and patronage-driven, which happened to include women, because women owned households and controlled resources. As the church became an institution, it centralized around male hierarchy, not because scripture changed, but because institutions standardized their power structures. The same thing happened in law, medicine, education, business. Institutions didn't reflect a fundamental theological truth. They reflected how large organizations organize themselves. One more. A Bible study group discovers the evidence about women leaders in early churches. Half the group wants to reinterpret their church's restrictions. Half thinks the early church was wrong, and modern restrictions are correct. Both sides are using the same texts, but reading them through different institutional assumptions. Nobody's lying. Everyone's reading the evidence through the lens of their current system. Results vary depending on which interpretation the institution will tolerate. Most people find this history threatening because they've been taught that current church structures are biblical, foundational, not accidental. But the text shows something different: flexibility, response to circumstance, and at minimum, gender-mixed leadership in the earliest documented period. The restriction came later, not as doctrine, but as practice, not as truth, but as structure. The final evidence. Look at where women's leadership persisted longest in smaller communities, with lower institutional pressure. You see women leading longer, sometimes right up to the medieval period, in centralized high-status urban churches with more formal hierarchy. Women disappear from the record faster. It's not that rural churches were more enlightened, it's that they had less institutional pressure to conform. Size and formality drive the restrictions, not doctrine. Think about what this reveals about how we read history at all. We assume institutions reflect their founding principles. They mostly don't. Institutions evolve to consolidate power and clarify authority. They inherit language from their origins, but reshape meaning to fit their structure. The language stays the same, the reality shifts, and once enough time passes, people forget that the reality ever meant anything different. Let me land this carefully. The letters Paul wrote were responses to real communities. Women were running those communities, not as an experiment, not as a failure, not as an anomaly, as the default structure of how Christianity worked when it was a household movement. That doesn't mean early churches were perfect. That doesn't mean we should replicate everything about them, but it means the historical record shows a different possibility. For a long time, that was the only way Christianity worked. And it worked. The three things to take away. 1. Scripture names women leaders and assumes their authority consistently. 2. Institutional restrictions emerged later as churches centralized structure. 3. We inherited the institutional interpretation without knowing there was a different original model. If this changes how you read Scripture or understand church history, that's the point. The Bible isn't silent about women's leadership. Centuries of interpretation created that silence. And once you see the original voices, you can unhear them